My name's Martin Purdy and I'm a First World War historian. I've written a number of books about the First World War, including about Gallipoli.
So, thank you, Martin. I was going to ask you about the impact that the war had for the people who lived in a certain area and what it might have been like for them joining up.
I think it was a very exciting concept to them. They didn't know what they were letting themselves in for, as indeed did no one really. It was the first ever industrialised warfare. So you have to try and put yourself in the lives of the people who lived it. So think about living with no television, no radio, no computers. It was quite a hard life. You worked quite often 6 days a week, and you worked very long hours, and you worked from a very young age. So, for example, one of the people from Rochdale, who was in a character in one of the books of mine, a real person, was called Charles Watkins, and he wrote in his memoir after the war that he was actually seen as one of the most educated people in the battalion because he'd been allowed to stay on at school after the age of 11, because most of his schoolmates at the age of 11 had to go to work in the factories and in the mills and start bringing in a wage, because there was a lot of poverty. So when the war breaks out, for example in Lancashire, a lot of the mills were only working on what's called half-time. So there was only part-time work available. So people were struggling for money. So joining the army meant that you got fed, you got a wage, you got a roof over your head, and best of all, with the war, there was an adventure. You were going to get out and maybe might even get overseas and get abroad. For people who perhaps had never ever, and I know this will sound crazy to you and to us, is that the idea that a lot of these people would never have been further than a couple of miles from their home because they didn't have cars, they didn't have the money to spend on going on public transport, they didn't have disposable incomes.
Would most of the young men, sort of 18 to 24 by something, in an area have signed up?
Yes, they would. The vast majority would. And they would have just seen it as a great adventure. And you have to think about things that we do even now, knowing all the things that we know, is that it's very hard sometimes when all your friends are off doing something to not get sucked into doing that. Well, imagine 100 years ago when there's not a great deal going on and a great deal of excitement. And all that's stretching before you is many years of working in sort of noisy and cold factories. Of course you're going to be tempted to go off on an adventure. So they all sort of, are volunteering to in the early years of the war to go off and fight. And in a lot of communities, they are initially brought together and train within the community to start off with, and there'd be 1,000 men in an infantry battalion. So you're talking about 1,000 men all gathered in one place. And in somewhere like Rochdale, where we are today, the Rochdale battalion, they all gathered in Rochdale, and there's a drill hall. The old drill hall in Rochdale was near where the railway station is today, and the 1,000 men were all put in houses around there, and you had no choice. If you lived near the railway station then, they would come and knock on your door and say, right, let's have a look at the size of your house. Right, we're putting 4 soldiers in here with you. And you didn't have any say in it. And quite often the people who lived in the houses had to sleep on the floor, and the soldiers had their beds. And then they trained in the town, and they marched around the streets, and it was, really exciting. You can imagine at the time, bands playing, and they had the bayonets sharpened in the main town square, and they were practicing, bayonet practice and shooting practice. But the problem with them training in the town is that, of course, all of the friends, the sisters, the brothers, the mums, the dads, would come and bring them bits of treats and come and chat to them, and it wasn't really preparing them for what it was going to be like to go to war. So after a few weeks, the whole battalion would be moved to somewhere where they were isolated really, and where they could start getting a taste of what it was really going to be like.
Of course, these were different from the regular soldiers.
Yes.
So the regular soldiers wouldn't have come from one area necessarily.
No, this is, I mean, when the war broke out, the professional soldiers, the men who were already in the army, there might be a battalion, say a Lancashire battalion, but they wouldn't necessarily be all Lancashire men. And it was very different. So the men who volunteered when the war broke out, it was different because they were sort of volunteering on the whole to serve with local battalions, and those local battalions would generally be made up of local men. So it's different.
What happened when they went away from the area?
Well, from Rochdale, for example, they were the Rochdale men were sent to the Pennine Moors over near Bolton, and they were camped out on the moors and away from sort of civilization, and they had to rough it. And they trained and practiced digging trenches and sort of just generally trying to fend for themselves, and putting up with being out in the wet and cold all day, and and then having to cook for themselves to a degree, and just fend for themselves. And then the next thing is they were then sent off to war, and they didn't know where they were going to. And they would have presumed that they would be going out to the Western Front, to France or Belgium. But they weren't. They were sent to, from around this part of the world, a lot of them were sent to Egypt. Now you can imagine what an adventure that is for them. To go on a boat across the Mediterranean to Egypt, and the heat and the sun, and training in the desert, the idea of seeing pyramids, and even seeing people of different faiths and different colours and different dresses and different food, and we take all of that for granted because we live in this wonderful multicultural society. But that was completely different to them, and it was, you can't even start to imagine the sense of excitement and adventure in that, and the letters that they're writing home and that were being reprinted in the local papers. Like around here it was the Rochdale Observer, and just that whole, I suppose, sense of otherness that was just thrilling. But then of course the reality kicks in when you then get sent into the heart of the battle. And they can't wait to get sent into the heart of the battle. They think this is what we're here for, and they don't realise the nature of what, as indeed most of the people who took part in the First World War had no understanding of what industrialised warfare was going to be like.
I suppose it took very long for them to change their thinking.
No, and of course at Gallipoli, it was a very different scenario to any of the other battlefields of the First World War, because if you were, say, in France or Belgium, you might be in a frontline trench, and you would serve a few days in the frontline trench, and then you would then get rotated out of it and spend a week, say, behind the lines, recuperating and being away from the guns. There was nowhere on the Gallipoli Peninsula that was safe from the enemy's guns. So at Gallipoli, it was totally different. Even when you weren't in a frontline trench and you were sort of supposedly having a break, you were still within reach of the enemy's guns. So there was nowhere on the peninsula that you could get away from it. And you can imagine psychologically the effect that had on you. And of course, it's incredibly alien terrain as well.
So let's move on to when they came back from Gallipoli after the evacuation, unless they went on to other places to fight. But what was it like for them returning home?
I think for the people, I think it was incredibly difficult for everybody involved when men came home, because what we forget is that men could serve. They might have signed up right at the start of the war, say in August 1914, and very quickly they get sent away after a few weeks of training, away from their community, some of these men survive the whole war. They don't come home till, you know, the end of 1918 or even 1919. That's over 4 years. They might have been lucky to have come home once or a maximum of twice in that whole period. And you just think about that. Think about if your brother or your father or your husband went away for that amount of time. When they came back, they would be almost a stranger to you anyway. But imagine the fact that they're not just coming back as someone who's been away. There's someone who's coming back who's been away to war, and they might have killed people. They've certainly seen dead people. Their friends have been killed, and they've come back mentally as incredibly different people in every sense of the word. That's very, very, very hard for everybody. It's hard for the men coming back to just suddenly slot into civilian life again. And it's incredibly hard for the people who've been at home, who then have to sort of accommodate this changed person back into their lives. There was a story that I found a very, very moving story about from my hometown, which is near here, part of Rochdale Borough. I come from a place called Middleton, and there was a man told me a story about when he was growing up after the war as a young boy, and he always remembered this chap who'd come back from the war, and he was horrendously disfigured, facially disfigured, and the only comfort he sort of could take as a child seeing this man was the fact that the man was blind. His facial disfigurement was such that clearly he was blind. So he used to think, well, at least he can't see his reflection. He doesn't know himself how terribly disfigured he is. But he said he always remembered that this man was led everywhere. He used to link his wife, and his wife used to lead him around the town centre in Middleton, and people would kind of be, you know, when they saw this chap, sort of aghast by the sight of him. And think about the woman, think about the wife, how incredibly difficult that must have been for her husband to go off to war and then come back from war with that level of disfigurement, and for her to be loyal to him, to be thinking for the rest of her life, because they were still quite young people, that she was looking at spending the rest of her life as a carer for this man, and you know, and the fact that the strength of that woman and the courage and the virtue of that woman, I think, is incredible, and it's something that I always think about is of those. Don't just think about the soldiers, don't just think about the war in the respect of men serving overseas. Think about the people at home and what their strength, and after the war their courage as well.